Thank you. Thanks for coming to listen to us talk about FedRAMP continuous monitoring trends and how we're trying to use those to improve secure development at Red Hat. So my name is Stephanie Harris. I am a principal product security engineer for the product security compliance team at Red Hat. I've been here about 3 years, a little over 3 years. And for that time, I've been the information systems security manager, or ISSM, for our FedRAMP program. I'll pass it over to my colleague.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Lusk. I'm also a principal product security engineer at Red Hat, and I've been with the company about 2.5 years. And my whole time there, I've been primarily FedRAMP. I've also done vulnerability management to support other initiatives like PCI DSS, SOC 2, and ISO.
Awesome. So today we're going to discuss a few different topics. We're going to give a little bit of an overview of FedRAMP and continuous monitoring, because we're just going to assume that there are going to be some people in here that don't know much about those. Maybe you heard the acronym, but not much else. We're going to talk about some challenges that we've run into while doing FedRAMP and while trying to find trends and suggestions for the secure development that we're talking about today. We're also going to talk about FedRAMP impacts on organizations in general, but specifically talking about our experience at Red Hat, some suggestions moving forward about secure development, and then what's next. Awesome. So FedRAMP and continuous monitoring, what is it? What are those? So FedRAMP stands for Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. Federal agencies in general have to follow a lot of laws, regulations, tons of policies. A big one that a lot of people look back on is Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA. That law came into effect and put some requirements, not requirements, but responsibility on NIST to create special publications to try to help agencies, meet the requirements of FISMA and the other laws that are out there. So there's tons and tons of special publications. The main one that we use for FedRAMP is 853. So it's a big, huge list of controls that you can put in place for your information systems. So FedRAMP was basically created to kind of help agencies adopt cloud-based services, just giving them guidance on what they can use, and to give private sector cloud service providers, or CSPs, guidance as well on how to meet those requirements so they can actually service the government agencies. So in a very, very abbreviated process, this is how FedRAMP goes. So a CSP decides that they want to go down the FedRAMP path. They want to be able to provide their offerings to agencies. So they go out and get an agency sponsor, and the first thing they do is they kick off. So you meet with your agency sponsor, you meet with the FedRAMP Program Management Office representatives, the PMO, and then you start your process. So this is, like I said, very abbreviated. So once you do your kickoff, you start getting into your assessments. You can do a readiness assessment if you want to show that you actually can meet the requirements or you're pretty close to it. Once you do that, if you decide to do it, then after you finish that, you go into a security assessment. So these are like 3 to 4 month-long assessments that you do with a third-party assessment organization, or 3PAO. So after you go through those assessments, you do a bunch of testing, sorry, I keep breathing into this. You do scans, you do pen testing, you do manual interviews with them. And once you finish, these big reports come out. They're given to your agency reviews them. After a couple months, they're going to say they're good with them, and they're going to give you an ATO, which is a authorization to operate. But after that, you still have to give it to the FedRAMP PMO, and they're going to do their review. So for us, we started ours in April of 2022. We got our ATO in December of 2022. So it took several months to go through that process. And then we were put in queue with the PMO. We had to wait like 6 months in order to be approved by them and put on the marketplace. So we did that. We got on the marketplace. We got our ATO from our agency sponsor, and we're done. We made it. We were accepted. We were put on the marketplace. We're completely done. High five.
Psych.
Yeah, just kidding. You're not done. You're never done. FedRAMP is never over. So once you get your authorization, you go through this process or get into this process called continuous monitoring. So there's tons of tasks that you have to do on a regular basis. Some of them are constantly, some of them can be annually, depending on what categorization level that you choose for your system, like what you determine the data levels at. So it could be FedRAMP low, FedRAMP moderate, FedRAMP high. So we're FedRAMP high. And that means that at the worst case, we're doing stuff annually, but down to constantly. So some of these you can see on our scared face, whatever, shocked face. There's pulling inventory. You have to pull that, review it, pull user access, make sure that you're still working with least privileged people that have access are supposed to continue to have access. You have to look at change management. If there's any kind of changes that are above what basic maintenance is, you have to go through and review it and figure out if it's a significant change. If it is, then you have to go through another assessment for that, which we've done several of those. So ports, protocols, services, looking for least functionality. There's tons of different aspects of continuous monitoring, but for us, our opinion that the most like resource consuming, time consuming aspect is scans. So scans and vulnerability management. So I'll hand it over to Chris to talk about scans.
Yeah, so everyone loves scans. I feel like this picture probably captures scanning for most people, but within FedRAMP, you obviously have vulnerability scanning, which is what most people think of, but you also have configuration scanning, which CIS benchmarks, STIGs, DISA, things of that nature. So you're constantly having to scan month to month, attest to those. It's just a constant cycle. So part of the situation as far as why we did this, so we were about 2 years into continuous monitoring. And we ran into some issues. So we were in a situation where we had seen our scope triple in size. We were very reliant on manual processes that didn't scale as we add new services and products within FedRAMP or plan to. We also saw an increase in CVEs. At some points throughout the year, we had hundreds. And then we were also limited in our engineering resources. And I think everyone knows here deals with remediations know that you can't fix everything, and maybe you shouldn't, but obviously you have to prioritize what's relevant to your environment and what's a actual threat. And then also questionable image hygiene. We had teams putting images in Boundary that had hundreds of CVEs, so there was issues there. So with those things in mind, we wanted to look into the numbers and see if we could spot some trends and see if we could prevent some of these from coming into the environment or even appearing on scans in the first place. So these are some of the other challenges that we had. And they fall into 3 categories. So the first would be overall continuous monitoring. So when we first started doing continuous monitoring in January 2023, we really had to build a whole program from the ground up with this. And again, we were reliant on largely manual processes that scale. Unfortunately, a lot of our work was within spreadsheets, as much as I love those. We also found ourselves in a situation where within Red Hat, we were evangelizing FedRAMP. We were going to teams asking them to fix things, and they had no idea what FedRAMP was and why we were asking them to meet these timelines for remediation. And then also, the other thing too, if you have tooling, you're looking to add new tooling within your environment, there's a certain process that you have to follow. You can't just have a tool or bring a tool in. It has to go through an assessment. It has to be evaluated and then approved.
Yeah, and so the next one, so that was kind of like overall issues or challenges that we ran across with FedRAMP in general, moving into continuous monitoring. But when we started seeing the images come in that had way more vulnerabilities than the norm, like when we had a smaller platform, we had an average of maybe like 20 to 30 vulnerabilities coming in as we would remediate other things. It's totally expected. When we moved up in our platform kind of tripled in size as we brought in new services and such, it moved up to being an average of like 70 to 80. But then we would see instances where like Chris said, hundreds, like 300 to 400 just randomly popping up. So we didn't want to ignore it, obviously, because it was out of the norm. And we also didn't want to just jump the gun. So I started reaching out and researching with the engineers, like what was the situation that led to this? We kind of had to do an after action report because it was pretty excessive for what we were used to. So this bullet here, finding image health solutions, the reason why I put that on there as a challenge was in meeting with different engineers, the challenges of using healthy images, it was multifaceted. Some of them, they weren't using old images. They were using the most recent being like within a month. But looking at some teams' repos going back a year, they just had an overall pretty poor health grade because our images are all stored in a solution that we have, a repository called Quay. And before something's pulled into our boundary, it goes through the Claire scanner and it gives a health index on what these images look like. So you can see the grade right there. Sometimes it's not. One of the challenges from one of the engineers was sometimes we don't get those grades right away. Sometimes there's a delay. And I asked about blockers. How can we block based on this grade? Maybe we should require a B and above. And I was, given the response basically that, it could cause problems operationally if we were to start blocking images that maybe started off with one grade and then, unknowingly something came out or a CVE was reclassified and it became, more severe. It could cause problems. So those are some of the things that I got when I went through and tried to research. And then the last one, I can't see it, analyzing vulnerability trends. Okay, so we had all this data, and FedRAMP High is an isolated, not air-gapped, but isolated platform. It's not in our commercial environment. So that means that any of the trends we have to we have to remove some of the data. We have to remove some of the data before we can put it into anything to try to analyze it. So using parts of scans instead of just having a scanner attached to something that can give you an overall health and metrics related to it, it's pretty difficult. So we had we used a lot of spreadsheets. It was a lot of fun, but we found some great metrics. So those were, pretty much the challenges that we ran into, like I said, with going into continuous monitoring and then trying to find solutions to hand off to other people to say, hey, we think that these might help us have better container health moving forward.
So now on to the vulnerability trends that we saw. Yeah, so again, this was captured from our first month in continuous monitoring in January 2023 up until January of this year. So we saw a total of 1,500 CVEs, and that was across 220 components. And then we did exclude the kernel vulnerabilities that were dropped last year. I think there were 673 in total. Yeah, so obviously that would have skewed the data a little bit. Not that those aren't relevant, but we wanted to look at those outside of the kernel issues. So from this data, we came up with three categories, or three top 10 lists, because everyone loves the top 10 list. So first, we identified the top 10 most commonly affected components. From there, we tried to identify the top 10 most common CWEs. And then last, we identified the top 10 most common CWEs that end up on our POEM. So POEM is essentially a FedRAMP acronym. It's for Plan of Action and Milestones. And essentially, it's a process, it's a document when you have something that goes past its remediation deadline. So you're basically overdue, and it's just things that aren't getting fixed in time based on the severity level. So looking at the components, I won't read each one of these off to you, but you could see here, these all accounted for, I think, about 42% of all the CVEs in the environment in that 2-year period, from the ones that you see here. And maybe at a more useful level, we put these into categories. So you could see here, programming languages that cut the font off on me, but it's over 53%, as you can see. And then next was CLI tools, which was 30. Libraries were at 10, and then cryptographic modules, basically OpenSSL, was right at 5.9%.
So the next top 10 list that we came up with was the CWEs that were relating to the vulnerabilities that we found. So we tried to line these up. So basically, all of this stemmed from like a paper that I wrote to try to give a proposal. And it's easy to give suggestions all day long, making a guess or an assumption. But we wanted to go back and look at the actual numbers and see, like what does this, the actual data, not just numbers, what does this line up to? What kind of, what category of weaknesses are lining up with those vulnerabilities that are showing up in our environment. So you'll see the list here. And again, I'm not going to read through all of them. They're there, and we're going to share the slides after the fact. But just looking through it, a lot of them are related to like memory-based weaknesses. And a lot of stuff like this can be mitigated through secure development practices, making sure that the testing is being looked at, and those items being remediated. And there's been a lot of Red Hat talks this week, and this is something that across the different teams, we're all looking at this to try to figure out how to do things a little bit better. So there's tons that we're making a few different tools. We're looking at different aspects, trying to figure out how to make this a little bit better. But yeah, so like I said, a lot of these were memory-based weaknesses. Some of the categories on here are listed on the MITRE site as their class level CWEs, and it's discouraged to map them because it's easy to provide misleading or false information. So we included them because they were in our top 10 with the full knowledge that later on we're going to have to dive deeper and figure out what exactly those categories, those CVEs were related to for, actionable data. So.
Yeah, and, excuse me, I think no surprise, the top 10 CWEs for the POAM were all ones that were on the top 10 more broadly. They were just in varying orders. So again, these were ones, that are past due, that have gone past the remediation deadline. So it's kind of redundant from the previous data. So now we're going to talk about some of the impacts of FedRAMP indirectly on Red Hat just by doing FedRAMP. So first off, one of the biggest things that I've seen has been improvements on our public-facing CVE pages. Because typically what we have when we, as part of our continuous monitoring, we report to our agency authorizer each month. So it's not uncommon to have CVEs where Red Hat would rate them as a different severity from, say, NVD, which is seen as the sole truth, or sole purveyor of truth as far as severities go. So typically what we have to do for those, we have to document them and submit them to our agency for approval. And we would have to go to our engineering teams to get an explanation of like why they rated that particular CVE as lower severity versus NVD. So as kind of a byproduct of that and getting those statements, we start to see those statements on our public facing pages, which is really helpful for not only our FedRAMP agency, but customers in general. And then as a side to that too, we were also, we were using our SSP controls within our FedRAMP environment. There's like 400 of them. So we've been using those controls to evaluate certain CVEs and actually to lower the risk because of mitigating control. So those statements as well have been published to the CVE pages for like compliance environments or environments that have higher levels of controls. Another thing that we saw was refinement of existing vulnerability remediation timelines for upstream commercial offerings, because we as FedRAMP were downstream consumers of the commercial offerings. So a lot of times we would go to the engineering teams and ask them to fix CVEs that are maybe more quicker than traditional timelines. And that's typically a lot of times you'd see that with moderates and lows as opposed to higher severities. Another impact we saw was extended product support life cycles. So in addition to fixing security vulnerabilities within FedRAMP, and Stephanie can maybe talk to this a little bit more, but you have to stay in FIPS approval. So you can't just go to the latest version that's available in commercial. There are certain cryptographic modules and other parts of the underlying operating system and software that has FIPS approval. So you have to fix vulnerabilities while maintaining FIPS approval. So it's like kind of like walking a tightrope. And then we also saw from our work and the scale of the work as we added new products and services, we saw the creation of new teams. We saw internal realignments of teams and just additional tools and resources to support FedRAMP. And then finally, just more broadly, the a rising tide lifts all boats ethos, where basically just by doing, all the work we're doing here, improving the posture of our FedRAMP environment, we're also benefiting Red Hat as well, more generally. So if you have anything to add.
Yeah. So like FedRAMP was such a major change for us with a lot of, there were a lot of changes that were surprisingly not expected across the company. So like Chris mentioned earlier, a lot of evangelism had to go along with us having to meet with teams to fix things and whatever came up. So the huge change that we had that comes along with this kind of a framework, it really caused a lot of changes across the board, rippling effects. So yeah, I think a lot for the better.
It depends on who you ask.
Yeah, right. The better or
Yes.
close.
Perspective.
So now getting into the suggestions that we came up with trying to fix some of the issues that we noticed and started to document. So first one, I've got the old eyes. I got to come over here. Okay, so blocking poor images. So like I mentioned earlier, I did get feedback from engineers saying, that we probably couldn't do this. And as I started to share this paper that I wrote, is like a 7-page long paper. I shared it with a lot of different engineers throughout product security, directors, managers that were that worked in the areas that I was going to provide suggestions for. I didn't want to like blindside anybody by putting a paper out saying that I think that these things could improve. So I started to get feedback, and it's impossible to keep up with all of the different initiatives and tools and things going on in a department like ours because things are constantly changing. So I actually was, somebody reached out to me about us moving over to Conflux as a secure pipeline, which was talked about yesterday in our colleague Rogue's presentation, if you want to learn more about that. But part of it is you can make secure profiles, which can, in fact, block images that don't have great health. So that was something that we started to look at, and the company as a whole has a timeline on when we're going to move all of our products over to it. It just takes time. It's not something you can put in place overnight. But it was really awesome to find out that the suggestion that we wanted to give was something that was already being worked on. And then next, enforcing secure development policies. So our company is very proactive on everything security. We have a pretty stout secure development lifecycle process in place. All of our products go through it, but it's still developing. It's still in its early stages. And, there's always room for improvement. So in conversations with the people that lead that area, I started to talk about enforcement because I think we forgot to mention earlier that FedRAMP is downstream from our commercial products. So that means that the majority of the images that exist in FedRAMP exist in our commercial products as well. So if we're seeing things there, then those vulnerabilities also exist in other places. But also keeping in mind, FedRAMP has to stay a little bit behind commercial in order to meet the FIPS requirements that we talked about in the last section. So I started to talk about enforcement, making sure that if there is major issues coming through, and we're talking like important criticals and exploited items, those need to be fixed before they're pushed out into the production environments and released. So not everything is going to be easy or fixed, as soon as other things can be, but it's something to keep in mind. And there's also exceptions in place for that process. So are the exceptions a little too loose? Are they okay? And it meets the needs of the company. We do tons of reviews to figure out how these vulnerabilities impact our products and how it could impact our customer. So it's not like they're not being reviewed and analyzed, to use a double negative there. So then the next couple suggestions.
Yeah, so I think one thing we want to do as a suggestion here is take some of these trends as we continue to analyze this data and see other insights, is take this to engineering teams, product teams, and see if we can implement better testing, see if we can do code reviews for the images and the tools that we use to build the images. And then also prioritize resources. Like I said earlier, I think it's the same for everybody. You can only, you only have so much time. Engineers only have so much time, and you can only fix so many things. So understanding like which vulnerabilities are actually a higher priority, more of a threat to our particular environment. We would continue to do that. Maybe integrate some automation aspects, so it takes some of the manual toil off those teams.
Yeah, and so the last two that we were suggesting, so training to the actual issue. We recently came up with some really awesome secure development training that's available to the entire company. It was mandatory for a while, and now it's just out there and available to people. But in going through and reviewing all the topics, there was nothing specific to image health or promoting poor images into a production environment, and like what the repercussions of that could be if these are the heftier items that we tend to, as a company, put a lot of time and effort into removing. So my suggestion was to make training that's a little bit more relevant, so that the engineers can understand what's going on when they're in a situation like that. And then the last one is accountability. Nobody likes to talk about accountability. But if you have teams that are on a regular basis skirting policies that are put in place for really good reasons, accountability needs to be put into place, and otherwise things will never change. All right, so what's next? All right, so some of the things that we wanted to do moving forward is we're going to definitely continue to collaborate with different product security and engineering teams to raise awareness of these trends and try to figure out how we can use them to better things as much as we can. We're also going to use these trends to improve secure development testing and remediation processes, just going hand in hand with what we just talked about on the last slide. We want to analyze more statistics, because the amount that we did just wasn't enough, and we're glutton for punishments and want to keep doing more. So something that we were thinking about after putting this together, and also like seeing some of the other topics, like maybe we should look at the severity levels per the CWE and figure out like how many were each category, for each category, like what were the severity levels. Because Vincent talked a couple days ago about the spread across the different severity levels. We had tons of moderates, but absolutely none of them were exploited. So if we look at things in terms of that and figure out which ones were, which CWE categories were appearing more, and which ones have more of the higher category, higher severity vulnerabilities, we can focus on those a little bit more. And then research metrics related to time to fix during build testing and time to fix in production. So if we put these suggestions out and we find out that it's, we want to prevent them from being in the production environment, that's the main point. But we have to look at, what kind of cost is it going to be to engineering? And make sure that any suggestions that we put out are, worth the effort and time and so on. The last one is continue to aggregate and study these metrics to help promote improvements. And that was our last slide. Thank you so much. We have like 1 minute for questions.
1 minute for questions.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Oh, come around. Oh, we have a question. Better be a good one.
Hey there. I was just curious, which aspects of FedRAMP did you feel were, unreasonable or maybe a bit too onerous?
Well, I have got an extensive government background, so I'm pretty used to those requirements. But
Not adapted to the open source.
One of the biggest things, so the open source part of it didn't really come too much into play for us. It was really just, working, it does like upstream, but for the most part, it's interesting to get into conversations with your auditors and have to talk about this kind of technology, because if you look at the 853 controls, and this is my opinion, I think it's a pretty good educated opinion, but those controls were made a while back when cloud was not yet widely adopted, and they were more, more focused on, on-prem environments. So when you get into these conversations with auditors, but more so the government representatives, it's hard for them to grasp certain aspects of our platform. And I assume that other cloud-based services run into that. So there's a lot of education that goes into place where immediately it's no, that's not going to meet the requirements. This is not compliant. But then we go through and educate them and explain it to them, then they come around a little bit and they understand more, okay, no, I understand that. And I can see now that it's compliant. So there's tons of education that goes along with it. I think that there's misconceptions that something like FedRAMP assumes that you're going to remediate every single vulnerability and they expect you to remediate all of them, but risk management is, you know, like in the title. So they give options for like showing that some of these are false positives. Some of them are operational requirements. Some of them are, you know, vendor dependencies, things like that. And having a POAM where you can document some of the things that weren't remediated on time, but that's all there for a reason. It's all about risk management. So as long as you can document it and you can explain it well enough, usually you're able to move forward and just continue on with, you know, a regular management of a platform like this.
I think what she was saying about fixing everything within the context of FIPS compliance, you're supposed to remain FIPS compliant, but you're also supposed to fix everything. And it seems like a lot of times they're at odds with each other. So fortunately with the agency we work with, they've been very flexible. And if we explain things to them, they've told us to prioritize, you know, fixing things. So, but it's like I said, it's a lot of times they're, you know, they're in conflict with each other. So that would be something from my perspective.
So the FIPS process, so basically I work adjacent to the FIPS. I get pulled into a lot of FIPS conversations. No, it's a,
I think
so it goes through the NIST cryptographic module validation process. And so you start off with a new module, you put it through like a third-party testing. Once you're done with it and that testing entity says you're meeting all these 140-2 or now 140-3 requirements, you can push it through and get into the queue for NIST CMVP to actually be like approved. They agree, they concur, and they put you on a list saying, you know, where you're at in the process. So in the past, up until about a year ago, it was very, very rigid with the government, and they wanted everything to be FIPS compliant no matter what. So if you had, you know, severe vulnerabilities and you wanted to move up, but your operating system wasn't validated, you couldn't do it. But yeah, but now those have changed, and there's documentation on the FedRAMP website that talks about, you know, there's two different, this is like going to go really in depth. There's two different streams. There's the validated path, and then once it's been validated, it can go into an update stream. So anytime it needs to be updated to meet new, you know, remediate new vulnerabilities, as long as it's previously been validated, it's in that update stream and it's approved by your agency or any agency that wants to utilize it, then, you know, it's a little bit more lenient and it will, you can do that. So there's so many ins and outs of FedRAMP, but that is a pretty strict one, like a fail used to be, but now they've kind of relaxed it a little bit.
I think they've been slow to approve new modules too. That's some of the
Oh yeah,
frustration.
the CMVP had a really
yeah.
bad backlog and had to take different measures to try to push people through and get that moving because it was such a huge issue.
All right, and at this time, we are out of time. If you want to further have conversations with Stephanie and Chris, feel free to reach out to them after the meeting. We're going to take a short break. The next meeting in this room will be at 4 o'clock. Let's give a good round of applause for the presenters.